This week we're looking at research methods related to agency records, in which agencies collect a lot of data on criminal justice, and we are looking at that stuff. Secondary analysis, which is analyzing data previously collected, so we're looking at previous outcome studies and research and things like that, case studies, whatever, and we're synthesizing and analyzing that information. And then content analysis is an examination of social artifacts such as written media, various records that are available to typically the general population, but sometimes, agencies that, for example, might have been classified in the past on certain topics, become unclassified, and then we can look at that, and that's content analysis. This type of research doesn't typically need research participants because we're looking at data sources, we're looking at historical documents. It's most commonly a descriptive or exploratory in nature, that research. And the content is usually looked at and analyzed to find important links between communication, perceptions of criminal justice problems, looking at individual and group behavior, and criminal justice policy. Much of the data that we can find is found in the public domains. Places such as the FBI, the Census Bureau, Bureau of Justice Statistics, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and other offices can readily give you information. It's found on their websites, it's found in libraries, things like that. But there's also non-public agency records, which various police departments, courthouses, for example, I belong to a drug court, and I know we push a lot of data up to the state and national levels for them to look at basically our statistics and outcome data. But there's also a lot of data that goes to these agencies that isn't necessarily published. So you could look at a police department, and they send a lot of data to the FBI for the Uniform Crime Report. But there might be a lot of extra data out there that isn't necessarily pushed to them, and that might be very useful data. For example, things such as crime hotspots. So you don't want to necessarily let the general population know where crime hotspots are, because you don't want the criminals maybe to catch on to that because you've caught on to them. But the police might give it to you because of they know you're not going to publish it, and they know you're not going to talk to the criminals, so that they feel safe giving you that information, but they wouldn't feel safe just putting it out there for public consumption. And then there's new data collected, which is kind of a combination, a hybrid of those looking at public information, the non-public information, and also combining it with basically other research or interviews or other data that you're collecting, surveys. So the units of analysis that we oftentimes find in this type of research can be like criminal activity, incidents, crimes, victims, offenders, court activities, defendants, filings, charges and counts, apprehension, such as arrests and offenders, corrections can be offenders, admissions, returns, discharges. Another important thing to remember when doing more qualitative types of studies is the sources of reliability and validity. So remember, you're looking at data not generated necessarily by researchers, it's generated by personnel of various probation departments and jails and offenders and things like that. So you don't necessarily want to rely too heavily. It doesn't necessarily allow for good reliability and generalization to other areas. And there can be simple things like clerical errors, because that type of data oftentimes comes from the everyday business. And with an everyday business, a lot of times people are going to be busy, and they aren't able to spend enough time on something, or somebody might just be plain old incompetent to do something, and we're looking at their data, and it's not good to necessarily generalize it to other populations. An important part of qualitative research and also content analysis is coding. So how are we going to code the different things that we're studying? First, it's really important to provide a good operational definition to our sample and to the units of analysis in which we're using, and know the difference between manifest and latent content. Manifest content is the things that we see on the surface. So, for example, a jail roster, and you might be taking random samples of people within that certain jail and trying to dig into those cases a little bit to see what part of the county that they came from, for example. The manifest content is just that, what I explained. But the latent content might be, well, maybe there's some poverty in those areas. Maybe it's an area that it's higher income, but it's a pocket of people that are really competitive, and a lot of times they're willing to be underhanded to gain something more. So we want to really be able to know how to code those two different things without making assumptions. And that's where reliability comes in, and how are we going to test reliability. So you could do the test-retest method, where we're looking at the data, and then we look at the data again later, and to see how well our coding matches up between the two times we looked at it. Or also you can do iterator reliability, where you have one researcher look at it, that set of data, and code it, and then another researcher comes in and looks at that data and codes it. And if they code it the same way, then that's showing that that has better reliability. So finishing up here, secondary analysis is data that we collect from other researchers. So let's say I do a study on the quality of life of individuals on probation. Somebody else comes in and says, well, this data is really good, don't need it, but this data here that those researchers did on the homelessness, and were they homeless before they were on probation, that's some data that is really useful to our study on the connection between homelessness and criminal behavior. So that is a secondary analysis, so taking data from other researchers. So you can get sources: Bureau of Justice Statistics, the National Crime Victimization Survey, and Uniform Crime Reports, and things like that, where you can get all this data that has been generated, and you can go in there and get that data secondhand from those sources, and to come up with your own studies. So the advantages of that, it's usually oftentimes cheaper, faster, and a benefit for work from skilled researchers, where they can go in, grab that data, and make quick use of it. But the disadvantage of it is the data might not be appropriate to your research questions, because the data's there and it's not quite what you wanted, and it might not have quite the design of the research that you wanted. So you're settling to some degree when you're looking at secondary sources. But if you're coming, again, doing a concise, quick, easy study that will be a benefit, and you don't need to have elaborate methodology, secondary analysis might be a good way to go. For example, today I was looking at the different programs that they use within corrections, and it had the number of studies, and then it had the approximate summarization of those studies, and put a recidivism percentage on that. And they really didn't do any of their own research this study, but it was really cool to have all these different studies that they incorporated into their study, and it helped to easily analyze the best practices within corrections.